Back to John for a minute, that I mentioned was born in 1814, 1815, who was brought into the Four Brothers family because he had also moved to Pulaski County, Missouri by 1860. He bought out from a Henry Gann's wife's brothers the land patent that was posthumously awarded to Annie Gann's father, Charles Lindsay. She was a Lindsay prior to marriage, for his service in the War of 1812. When he bought it out, that's why the descendants of this line started putting together pieces of what they thought were the family puzzle, because to them that gave John a direct connection to Henry via Henry's wife. And we have later, you see the grandson of John Gann, the granddaughter of John Gann married the son of William Gann. Okay, so, again, married again, they must be cousins. And so someone decided, well, John and William must have been brothers. So again, these are kind of logical conclusions we draw on the front end, but these are just hypothetical research questions that have to be followed through. So there was nothing to question about the four brothers. They all appear in Missouri at the same time. They all have interlocking relationships with each other. Nothing to question, or was there? In that 1891 sworn statement that I showed you a few slides back that George Gann made for Annie, he was supporting a Civil War widow's pension for her. Annie was the widow of Henry Gann. And George had a peculiar way of expressing his relationship to Henry and Annie. First, he corrects the marriage date from 1840 to 1842. Do you see how it's written over? Okay. And then he says he was personally acquainted with Henry and Annie, which sounds like a personal distance from, not a close relationship to them. And then he describes them as the contracting parties. And then he adds, well, that in itself, that description sort of adds an additional layer of distance instead of familial closeness. Then you see how the clerk lifted his hand. I'm not going to, David, may I wander? Right here. When I taught English at the University of Central Arkansas, I used to tell students, read for style and not just content. And what this signals to me is the clerk in the clerk's office, he lifted his hand because he thought that George was finished talking. That's why we take our hand away. Now, he may have taken it away to re-ink his pen. That is a possibility. But I don't think in this case that that's what it is, because he goes on to write, affiant further states that Henry Gann was his brother. Further states, that's additional information that George added. We are inclined to believe as researchers that legal records never contain anything but absolute truths. But as researchers, we know that's not the case. We have to look carefully at the context of every record and correlate it to every other record we can find to resolve conflicting evidence where it exists. This is an example of conflicting evidence that you see right in front of you. George was wrong. Henry Gann was not his brother. And I have the question mark on George down there. So now these four brothers aren't four brothers, are they? We don't know how many of those four brothers could be brothers or are brothers, but we're going to proceed with the research and find out. I'm sure George knew that Henry was not his brother. Mary Gann would not likely have had two living sons named George born a few years apart, would she? Now, sometimes parents did recycle names. If an older sibling died in childhood, infancy, whatever, they would bestow that memento mori name on a successive child. But George Daniel Gann, Bobette's ancestor, was still living in 1891 when George made this affidavit. And so there is another thing about George. George Gann, who made the affidavit, his Y-DNA haplogroup, he's the only one in our Gann surname project who has the haplogroup E-L117. Mary Gann's Birchfield children carry the JM172 haplogroup. These are two totally different branches on the phylogenetic tree. They don't correspond at all. So George Daniel Gann, who is Mary's son, and George Gann had no paternal relationship to each other whatsoever. The parentage of George Gann of the four brothers at this time remains unknown. Is there anyone present here today who is a descendant of this George Gann? Well, we need to invite them next year. It may have been an impulsive move and not a planned action that gripped George into declaring that Henry was his brother. Maybe Henry was like a brother to him. They had lived next door to each other for at least 6 years, and I think probably upwards of 9, possibly 10 years. But maybe George reflected just in that moment, that split second, you know how we'll make a split second decision to do something, that besides Annie's brother Charles, who is still living, there really wasn't anyone around who could substantiate the fact of her marriage to Henry. Now, he could have left it at that he was present at the marriage. That would have worked. That's all that he needed to say. But he has confused us for a long time, hasn't he? Wrong genealogies do that. They get us off track. They take us down rabbit holes that we get lost in and we can't follow because, in fact, they don't exist. It's fairly easy to determine why George fudged his relationship to Henry. He was trying to help Annie get that Civil War widow's pension that she needed. Henry had been not only a soldier in the Missouri Home Guards in 1861, but he was a soldier who came down with some unspecified chronic lung disease about a month after mustering in. A couple of affidavits mention the cough, chills, and fever description, and if you read through, it sounds very much like tuberculosis, but that word is never mentioned, and it might not have been mentioned if he had it simply because the government could have protested and said, He may have brought this into the service. He may have had a pre-existing condition, and we hear that word a lot these days, don't we? What is fairly certain is that the pneumonia that ended Henry's life on the 13th of February, 1877 was, it could have been a blessing in some ways. As researchers, it's a blessing for us because he does have a tombstone. He was only 52 years old, and his last years must have been miserable when you read through the application. Let's talk about George just for a moment. George performed a selfless act of charity because George Gann was a good man, and his neighbors thought so too. They called him Judge George when he moved to Pulaski County. Just a few years after moving there in 1866, he was a justice of the peace there, and from 1882 to 1890, he was the county probate judge. In 1891, when he made the affidavit for Annie, he was not in office at all, and that's kind of of course, he did that affidavit in a civil capacity and not a capacity of office. From 2 years after making the affidavit, from 93 to 96, he was superintendent of public schools, and from 1899 to 1906, the year before he died, he was Pulaski County's circuit clerk and recorder of deeds. Now, George's altruistic fabrication did help Annie draw a widow's pension of $8 a month until her death on the 1st of January 1899. But that singular act of declaring Henry to be his brother, I cannot stress enough, it played havoc, as wrong genealogies always do. Because oh, what a tangled web of false brothers George did weave. And you know, he never once thought we'd ever find out. We don't know exactly how Henry himself chose to spell his name. Many records show the more typical 2N Gann spelling, while others have the 1N spelling. Annie had a preference for the 1N spelling, as did Judge George and John. Annie decided to correct the government on the matter of their misspelling, so she sent them an affidavit saying, "My late husband's name was Henry Gann, and this is the correct spelling of the soldier's name." Now, if you look at this, you'll see two places where it's spelled Gann as well up at the top in the matter of the, so it's kind of ironic that we have both spellings of the name while she is correcting the government on their wrong spelling. And his records actually were recorded under the Gann spelling name too. So here's Henry Gann's gravestone. Henry entered eternity with a 1N spelling that either he or Annie or both of them preferred. It's visible on his broken and repaired. Isn't that wonderful that this gravestone was repaired, because so many of them aren't. This is on his family cemetery on his old farm at Elston, Missouri, which is just a few miles outside the capital city, Jefferson City. And legible, clearly legible, are his date of death, 13 February 1877, and his date of birth. Isn't that wonderful? And we're going to correlate that date of birth to other records. He was born on February 2nd, 1825. And by correlating records, we can know for the first time which family Henry came from. Does anybody want to guess based on the name of today's program? Do you think he could be one of the sons of Mary Gann? Let's see. In two of Annie's affidavits, she stated that she and Henry were married by Layman Jones near Dandridge in Jefferson County. She did not recall the day of the marriage, and she was off by 2 years. But she was correct about Layman Jones, though he was a JP in that capacity and not a minister. And if I had my druthers on this, I would much druther that she remembered Layman Jones than the date or the year, right? People didn't used to keep track of things like we do today. Layman Jones may have been memorable to Annie because in 1847 she and Henry bought the same 50 acres of land that adjoined Elizabeth and Mary's 25 acres that Jones had sold to Job Parrott, there's that name again, in 1838, in which Mary Gann's brother Alexander Gann was one of the witnesses. Job Parrott never registered that deed until the 19th of November, 1847, a full 7 days after he had actually deeded it over to Henry on the 12th of November. Both of the deeds were registered on the same day. Now, witnesses to deeds are often the kinsmen, typically of the buyer. Sometimes you're going to see them just of the seller, I suppose if a seller really needed to get rid of something, but oftentimes it's the buyer. John Russell was a neighbor and a brother to the William Russell who married Alexander Gann's daughter, Margaret. Charles Lindsay was Henry's brother-in-law, Annie's brother, who moved to Cole County, Missouri with them by 1856. And here we have a William Gann, who is also a witness on this deed and who is associated with Henry. Besides officiating at Henry and Annie's marriage, Layman Jones had also officiated at Martha Jane Gann's marriage to Allen Harris. Martha Jane Gann was a daughter of Elizabeth Gann, and thus she was a sister to Mary Gann and a half-sister to Alexander Gann. Here you see line of and Gann's, and this is just an awkwardly written double possessive using the word of, and plural construction, meaning the line of belonging to the two women named Gann, not that their last name was Gann's. It's critical to our discussion of the identity of Mary Gann's sons that Allen M. Harris served as bondsman for 3 Gann marriages, one in 1837 and 2 in 1842.